In order to really understand what Bob Moog and Don Buchla were doing, what their intentions were, what their inspirations were, and why they did what they did, we have to start with the history of electronic music. Now, I know today we think of electronic music as what we're all doing with synthesizers, but the fact of the matter is electronic music is a compositional style that started back in the 20th century and early on in the 20th century. That compositional style has a history of its own, motivations of its own, and it fueled technological development that ultimately led to what Don Buchla and Bob Moog did. It was their foundation. So if we're really going to examine what they did, we have to know why they did what they did. So I'm going to take a slight detour here, and we're going to talk about the history of electronic music in a way that gives rise to the motivation of both Don Buchla and Bob Moog. At the turn of the century, there was a giant movement of new outlook and new pursuits, whether it was technological or social or artistic, musical, political. This notion that we were capable of new things and progress was moving forward was really very potent, and it was tied in with our technological development. This technological development gave a whole bunch of different groups of people the sense that there was a future, and the future was going to be amazing. And this new movement definitely touched music. With the invention of the telharmonium in 1897, composers realized, wait, we don't have to continue to use these tired old instruments from the 19th century. These instruments that we've been using largely for 100 years, we can get beyond them using electronic technology, which gives us the ability to break free from all of the limitations that had previously existed in compositional style or application. Composers were thrilled at the notion that there was a future out there for music that didn't have to do with its past. And so there were movements that started to rise where people were saying, okay, we need to reinvent music. The futurist movement, for example, was exactly this, a movement to rethink music and to apply new technology and new ideas and new instruments in order to realize a new style of art, a new musical style of art. And this concept spread like wildfire amongst composers, because this is a very exciting and inspirational premise that you could break free from the limitations of acoustic instruments and really focus what you envision as your composition. This was incredibly influential. And then there were people like, for example, Edgar Varese, who was so inspired by this concept that he became a sort of cheerleader for it, making points about how the application of this new concept, new electronic instruments, would free the composer. And his influence was tremendous, even influencing John Cage to speak in Seattle about electronic instruments in 1937. The movement grew and grew. And as the composers, of course, shouted about how they wanted to make electronic music, they also needed to have the tools. And that's this weird pairing of, artists and then technologists coming together to create new, not only art, but new tools for art. So the inventors, who were also thrilled about the exciting promise of progress through electronic application of electronics, were more than happy to meet up with the composers. And some of the composers became electronics interested people because they wanted to be able to use electronics to create exactly what they envisioned. So this giant groundswell of artistic and technological progress became a huge, huge thing. Now, interestingly, because electronic instruments were unique and had special requirements, unlike acoustic instruments, and because the development of recording technology was coming along parallel with the development of electronic sound technology, these two things came together because a lot of the electronic instruments created couldn't, for example, give you an orchestra. But recording them actually could provide that. So this technological development of recording ran parallel with the technological development of electronic music sound sources. And this sort of culminated in this concept that instead of the concert hall, instead of the stage, the place where electronic music that really came together was in the studio. And then there became this element, this secondary element, where the studio then became the compositional tool. It wasn't just the electronic instruments, they were certainly part of it, but it was the integration of the electronic instruments and their recording, because to really put electronic sounds together, they needed to be able to record them and then put the recordings together to create even larger recordings. It was really the only way that electronic music could be created. And this became the traditional procedure and outcome that we call electronic music. It was the combination of sound sources, either recorded or electronic, putting them together in a studio and then creating an output. That was the original medium of electronic music. And so electronic music studios started popping up, where there were a lot of different electronic sound sources, all kinds of disparate electronic sound sources that could be recorded in primitive recording technology, and the tape could be cut up and spliced and recorded again in order to create multi-track recordings of electronic sound sources. This became the electronic music movement. But, I mean, even though composing and directing an orchestra and notating extensive compositions, etc., is hard enough, trying to be creative with new technology, with new language and new conceptual application within this studio wherein everything was a whole new way to perceive art, wasn't particularly easy either. And composers struggled to try and find ways to create sound and record sound and then notate that sound and then ways to perform that sound. This was all very adventuresome and new and experimental. Unfortunately, part of the side effect of that was that it became somewhat inaccessible as composers sought new forms of musical expression. They left the old forms behind, using new technology, new timbres, and applying them and performing them in totally new ways. All of this sort of created an accessibility problem for electronic music. While composers and academicians and etc. were really thrilled about the new ground they were breaking, the concept of music as an expressive art form was kind of left in the dust. And the studio, more than a means of expressive music creating, became a means of intellectual music making, which was very interesting and it certainly was new. But it did sort of leave behind the notion of expression and expressive performance of an instrument. Of course, when people are pursuing a new futuristic thing, they don't always think about what's being left behind. And they didn't. Now, an important aspect of this was then, as composers started making this music, it was really hard to do. So they had these gigantic studios filled with machinery that was filled with tubes, and it was big and disparate. So once again, technology and composers came together, and we started to have efforts to bring these complicated and disparate technological studios into more focus. And that's why for example, in 1955, the RCA synthesizer was invented. It was, hey, let's take all these components and make them into one solid studio situation where all of the oscillators are built in, all of the filters, all of the amplifiers, all of them are built into one set of panels so that they are easily applicable and accessible for the composer. And it was a revolutionary idea to take the studio and make it into a solid thing, kind of a device in itself or a musical instrument. And right as this happened, we had another development that was super important, and that was the transistor. All of this technology so far had been using tubes, which were giant and hot and required a tremendous amount of power and were problematic as a result. But the transistor allowed the possibility of taking all of that equipment and shrinking it down to size into a manageable, smaller, even personal electronic music studio. And that's where our story begins.